Welcome to the DiscipleSmith's podcast. Today's episode is a bonus episode where we will be covering who could have possibly been the Pharaoh during the time of the Exodus. This is the DiscipleSmith's podcast. Well, hello and welcome to the DiscipleSmith's podcast. We're having a special episode today to discuss who was the Pharaoh during the Exodus. And so I've put together a timeline on the theory that I think is the most plausible. I've done a lot of research on this, and so my brain is just kind of going crazy, but we're going to try to get through this as best as possible. So some of the clues to discern who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus are going to come about later on. But let's start off looking at some of these different facts. I have a lot on this board, but don't let this overwhelm you. We're going to be taking this step by step and kind of looking at it as we go. On this side, I have some of the ancient Egyptian time periods drawn out and labeled, and it's broken down in this way. So ancient Egypt existed for a long time. However, we're going to be looking at this first intermediate period, which lasted from 2181 to 2055 BC. That's over 4,000 years ago that this first intermediate period existed. So that's going to be around the time of Abraham that we're looking at this first intermediate period. We go on to the Middle Kingdom. That is the next Egyptian classification for their periods. And that lasted from 2131 BC to 1690. So pretty long range there. We also get into the second intermediate period, which lasted from 1674 to 1549 BC. And then finally, we get the New Kingdom, which is where I believe the Exodus happened. It's the longest reigning kingdom here on our list of Egyptian chronology here between 1549 BC and 1069 BC. Nearly to the point of King Solomon, King David, and King Saul around that time, whenever they are all kings of Israel. Just within 100 years or so of their reign ends the New Kingdom reign. So we looked at Abraham, who is chosen by God from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. Now I believe that he was chosen because of his pure genetic bloodline, tracing his lineage all the way back to Seth, and if you've been following my videos, you can kind of see how that works out in Scripture. These are some, I don't want to say very loose, but some pretty loose dates right here for the birth of each of these patriarchs. So the nation of Israel started with Jacob, but really it started with a blessing on Abraham. God told him he was going to make him a great nation who would bless the entire world through his offspring. And so you have Abraham, 2166 BC. You see here he would have been born during this first intermediate period. You get the birth of Isaac in 2066. Remember, Abraham was 100 years old whenever he had Isaac. So that's where this date comes in. Isaac gave birth to Jacob and Esau. Remember, they were twins around 2006 BC. And actually, 2006 is whenever I graduated, but that's AD. So we're nearly 4,000 years separated from the birth of Jacob and the graduation of Kevin Smith. So pretty interesting coincidence there. Might be a mystery to look into. I don't know. We'll have to see what's going on there. Then you have Jacob having Levi and Joseph. Joseph was probably born around 1915, and then his death would have been 1805 BC. So this 1805 BC, we're here at the Middle Kingdom now. So the Pharaoh during Joseph's time is a little bit harder to pinpoint, because if you start going back past this New Kingdom into these two kingdoms, the Egyptian timeline gets really confusing. And there's widespread debate over when each of these pharaohs ruled and how long they ruled for and that sort of thing. And so there is some dispute, even among professional archaeologists, on when exactly these kings, these pharaohs, reigned. Now, some can give recorded datings through radiocarbon dating of some artifacts there and things like that, and also what they reported in their hieroglyphs as they state how many years that each king reigned and things like that. But you have to understand, they used a completely different calendar than we use today. They used a different calendar maybe for even each period, because each one would go by either the sun or the moon or the different events that would happen, that sort of thing. And so you get pretty sure on the New Kingdom dates. I mean, I'm not saying it's exact, but you get pretty close. Once you start getting into these dates may fluctuate a little bit. And so I say all this because who was the Pharaoh of Joseph? Well, that's, I would say, virtually impossible to determine. You have a few different kings, though, during that time who reigned during a time of prosperity. I would kind of look at that. You also have what you would be looking for is a widespread time of famine. But the thing is, like with the Egyptians especially, they don't really like to talk about the bad things that happened to them. No pharaoh wants to be remembered as being this pharaoh who led his people through this plague, because after all, he's supposed to be like the representation of God in Egypt. And so if he reigned during a time of famine, that might reflect on him that he wasn't in good communion or good standing with his God, whom he was the representation of. And so a lot of the times you don't get this, you get kind of this bed of roses, so to speak, interpretation of Egyptian history. And so it's unlikely, I wouldn't think that you would find this, depiction of the land being in famine. I just don't think that you're going to see that. Like I said, though, you may find some evidence of a pharaoh who ruled with prosperity, that sort of thing. And so you have Joseph dying around 1805 BC. Jacob had his sons Joseph and Levi. Levi gave birth to Kohath. Kohath and Jochebed were brother and sister. Kohath had Amram. Amram married Jochebed, who was Kohath's sister, so he married his aunt. Yeah, gross. But then they gave birth to Aaron and Moses, and we get this timeline going on here. We're not sure. These are kind of loose dates. We're not sure exactly when Moses' birth would have taken place, but there are a few clues that we can pick up on to determine the pharaohs and their reigns and that sort of thing. So a couple of interesting things before we kind of move on from the birth of Moses is some of this Egyptian history. Now, there's a theory floating around because there was this group of people called the Hyksos who came into Egypt from the land of Canaan. They were kind of a mysterious group. Nobody knows exactly who they were other than they call them the Hyksos. They came in and they kind of took over Egypt for a time. They replaced their kings, their pharaohs, that sort of thing. And all we know is that they were from Canaan and they came in and kind of ruled Egypt for a while. Now, some people have the theory that the Hyksos actually were the Israelites coming in, and this might have been led by Joseph, and that's how they were able to take over. I just don't think that was the case. I think that by the time the Hyksos came in, I think the Israelites were already slaves in Egypt, and I think the Hyksos just so happened to wander in and take over. I think it would have added to the fact that Egypt had this sort of racism towards the Israelites, and they had placed them in slavery already, and then you get this group of people coming in from the same land of the Israelites who come in and kind of take over. I think it would have just fueled the racism even further, to the point where these Hyksos would have created in the Egyptians, by the time they drove them off, just an absolute they would have hated the Israelites by this point. And that's kind of where we pick up the story. There's just some years of silence. We don't really get anything between Joseph and Moses. We just happen to see Moses coming onto the scene whenever the Israelites were growing so large that the Pharaoh started killing off the male children of the Israelites. Now, fortunately for Moses, his mom placed him on basically like a little floating thing and sent him down the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter of the time just so happened to be nearby and saw this, picked up baby Moses, spoke with his sister, and they found his mom, who would have been Jochebed, and had Jochebed nurse him and raise him to health, and even paid her to do that. So this is really our first major clue, and it's kind of a breakthrough really for this whole timeline of who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And to find that, you have to realize who Pharaoh's daughter might have been. Now, it's pretty interesting because obviously a bunch of pharaohs probably would have had daughters. I mean, there's a 50-50 shot, right? So almost every pharaoh would have had a daughter along some point, but most of the time it's the men who get the recognition as sons because they become the pharaoh. Well, there's one figure in the ancient world who is a woman who actually holds the title of Pharaoh's daughter, and it is a royal, I don't even know how you would say it. It's like a royal designation. It's a accommodation. What do you call that? Accreditation. Trying to think of the word. I can't think of it. It's a title though that she experiences, and it is a queen who becomes Pharaoh, and her name is Hatshepsut. Now, I'm just going to refer to her as Hat from now on because that's a really hard name to pronounce for me. But anyway, she has the title of Pharaoh's daughter. So let's look at the timeline. Hat, her dad, would have been Thutmose the First. This may have been the king who gave the order to kill off all of the babies. Now, Thutmose the First rule is between 1570 and 1506. Now, why would that be relevant? Because he's the first king who was king after the Hyksos left. So you get the arrival of the Hyksos, 1710 to 1570. Then you get Thutmose the First reigning right after the Hyksos. Now, if you're a true descendant of Egyptian heritage, and you just drove out people who came from the land of Canaan, you just drove them back to their homeland. Meanwhile, you have people from Canaan living in your land. Don't you think you're going to treat them a little bit different? It just makes sense. So Thutmose the First had looked upon the Israelites and saw that they were growing, that they're going to become more numerous, and if they decided to, they could actually spring together, create a coup, and just completely wipe them out. And so I believe he was the one who ordered the babies of the Israelites to be killed. He had a son, Thutmose II, and he also had a daughter named Hatshepsut. And so Thutmose I would have died. Thutmose II would have taken over. Thutmose II would have been the Pharaoh who Moses was around whenever he killed the Egyptian who was mistreating the Israelite slaves. Now, to kind of back up a little bit, Hat would have been around Moses and would have helped take care of him and raise him and teach him all the ways of the Egyptian people. In fact, in history, she's recorded as being trained as a priestess herself. And so she would have basically taught Moses the Egyptian language, all the pagan practices of the Egyptians, He probably would have dressed like an Egyptian and talked like an Egyptian, had their accent, all those sorts of things, while also being a Hebrew and having those Hebrew features that would distinguish them from the Egyptians. And so Hat would have raised Moses essentially to some degree. Now, if Moses would have killed the Egyptian guard, Thutmose II could have been the one who went after Moses and was going to kill him. So that would make sense that Thutmose II would have had to have died in order for Moses to return, which is what kind of happens in the chronology here. So Thutmose II's death would have allowed Moses to come back into the land. But Moses was in the land of his father-in-law, Jethro, for a time. So something happens here during the Egyptian timeline. Thutmose II dies. He doesn't have an heir of age, so his wife, Hatshepsut, actually takes over and acts as Pharaoh. Meanwhile, Thutmose III, the next in line, the successor, he's too young. He's like 9 years old at the time. And so they're actually co-regent for a time, where Hat is acting as Pharaoh. She even has these stelas and everything, and these statues built of her, and she has the Pharaoh's, beard thing coming down and the hats, and she presents herself as the Pharaoh, the chosen one of the gods who came down to be this queen, this Pharaoh. And so they're co-regent for a time, and Hat dies, and Thutmose III takes over, and he is the sole Pharaoh. Now, one of the things to note about Thutmose III, he came in and basically had this hugely successful military campaign. He ran 17 campaigns year after year after year for 17 years, and he never experienced a single loss at all. Every military conquest he went after, he executed with 100% efficiency. Not only that, he was actually on the front lines of battle with many of these battles to inspire and encourage his men to go into battle and to do the things that he had commanded them to do. And so this Thutmose III is known as like the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, except he's a little bit better than Napoleon because he never lost a battle. But at the end of these 17 years of military campaigns, he just stops. No more. After this time of unprecedented expansion, things just halt to a dead stop, and he never goes on a military campaign again. Not only that, he goes into all the temples that have Hat as a statue or anything like that, and he starts defacing all of the statues. Now, what could have possibly happened for him to be so angry with Hat and to stop all of his military campaigns? Well, it makes me wonder if that's the Pharaoh where God called Moses back into the land. Moses was terrified to come back, even though everybody else had died. Thutmose II had died. Thutmose I was gone. He would have been terrified because he probably would have known about Thutmose III's exploits and his military conquests. So I could imagine him being scared. And so this is the Pharaoh, I believe, that Moses and Aaron went before, who he threw the staff down and became a snake. Then Thutmose III would have had his Egyptians, his weirdos, come in and do the same thing. He would have had them turn the water to blood, that sort of thing. And I believe at the end of his military campaigns, it was the Israelites who led his armies into the Red Sea and just absolutely got obliterated during the Exodus, and that's what caused him to stop his military campaigns. Pharaoh was left behind. He still ruled for a time being, but you don't see any more military conquests. He basically led Egypt into this time of prosperity and then stopped. Now, this would have been devastating for the Egyptians. Had they shown any kind of weakness during this time, all their enemies could have invaded and just basically taken over, plundered them. So I would say that he probably faked strength for the remaining time of his reign there, so that the armies from the opposing cities and countries wouldn't come in and destroy them completely. A couple of things to notice here is that this 1446 is the time that I have for the Exodus, and that marks the end of Thutmose III, his military campaigns. Some people date this at 1200 because they claim the city of Ramses was what was being built by the slaves, and so that's who was the ruler. There's not really much evidence archaeologically for that. Also, you may have noticed over the past 50 years they've led some expeditions into the Red Sea, and they've actually found chariot wheels and things like that, and guess which dynasty they belong to. It's not Ramses II, it's actually the 18th dynasty, which would have been this time right here. There was just a different spoke. It was like a 5-spoke instead of something else, and they're able to determine by dating, and so it just makes a little bit more sense for this to be the timeline. Also, just because it mentions the word Ramses in it doesn't mean that was the pharaoh that was there. They could have been working on a city named Ramses, which could have been retroactively named that in the scriptures because that's what Moses would have been familiar with. And so one other thing to note, in the scriptures, it talks about Moses being named, and it says it in a weird way. He wasn't named by his mom. He may have had a Hebrew name originally, but it says that the Pharaoh's daughter named him. Now, if you're the daughter of a Pharaoh, or the son of a Pharaoh, which if Hat adopted Moses, then you take on the name of the person. Just like if I were to adopt somebody, they would get my last name, Smith. So notice these names here, Thutmose. It kind of makes sense that Hat would name him Moses. That would have been an Egyptian name. He didn't have the Thut in the beginning because he wasn't actually a ruling pharaoh. He didn't get that title yet. He wasn't ordained as a god on earth, so to speak, during this time. So this is a very Egyptian name that would have translated over, and this is kind of how we get that. So again, I'm just going to end it here because this is a lot to take in. If you want to just kind of check out this timeline and see what you think, if you have a disagreement, just let me know. This isn't, for me, a deal breaker. If you show me a flaw in this, that's great. I've researched this for hours and hours and over many years and just kind of looked, and this just makes the most sense to me. And so if you have anything that you want to add to it or take away, or if you just like it, just give me a thumbs up. Comment. If you want to subscribe, we're going through the Bible in 1 year, and so that's kind of what inspired this to take place. I didn't really have time to cover that in my original videos. And so thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Kevin. I'm part of the DiscipleSmith's podcast. Thank you so much for watching.